Hello and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abrar Ahmad and I'm the founder of Legum Impact. Legum Impact is a social enterprise that specializes in ESG, sustainability, and other legal related matters. In today's program, we will be talking about climate justice and our courts and government's approach towards it. And for that, we are very lucky to have been joined by two eminent guest speakers who are lawyers. First of all, we have Muneeb Qadir, and second of all, we have Ms.Sumaviya Sajjad. First of all, thank you so much for sparing some time for us. It's an absolute pleasure. So, climate change is a common concern of humankind, and the concept of it has grown in recent years. It's not just environmental crisis anymore, but it's also a human rights issue that threatens the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. The loss of life from climate catastrophe is happening more in less developed states where the extreme weather events devastate food supply and access to clean water. And that's where the concept of climate justice becomes really relevant and important. So just to start off our discussion, I think it would be great to hear from you, sir, that what exactly we mean when we say climate change. And if you could also highlight its relation with climate justice, like what it entails in actuality.
Right. So both these terms, climate change and climate justice, I believe that they are very broad in the sense that they have been given a lot of definitions and different definitions from time to time. But, roughly speaking, in layman's terms, climate change is the phenomenon that has been witnessed for decades now, and we are only talking about it we've started talking about it very recently. We should have started that long time ago. But climate change is how our environment is being affected and the planet becoming unsustainable with each passing day owing to our reliance and dependence on greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, if you just look at the way that we lead our lifestyles, specifically from the global north, the developed world, all the way to the developing world, we are so dependent on, creating energy by burning fossil fuels. This dependency on things like, I would say, oil extraction, fracking, that has been quite controversial in Britain. Post-industrial revolution life that we are so accustomed to in this day and age, that has created an extremely adverse impact on our environment. And like I just said, it's going to impact gravely on the sustainability of the planet, and that is why in the sustainable development goals that the UN has set, protection of environment, tackling climate change issues is so central. At the same time, I see that a lot of people use the terms climate change and global warming interchangeably. Now, global warming is a symptom of climate change. But climate change is a broader term in the sense that, starting from rising sea levels all the way to, melting ice caps, every single thing. In Pakistan, we see, particularly where I'm sitting in Lahore, we see something called smog. How pollutants are destroying our environment at the same and putting human life at health, particularly vulnerable children. So all of these are features of the wider term climate change. Global warming is one of those issues. Now, climate justice is then the human rights or the humanitarian aspect of the same problem. And so climate change means that it's those who are the least to blame for climate deterioration, for this damage to our ecosystem that we're seeing, who end up suffering the most. And it relates to inequalities in terms of gender, age, race, health, so many factors. And those who are most vulnerable and the least to be blamed are the ones who are suffering the most because of the very people who are profiting from this from this system which enables climate change and climate deterioration in the first place. So that is one issue that climate justice seeks to address. That is, we need to ensure that people, particularly minorities, indigenous communities, people living in rural areas, they are not adversely affected because of corporate profits, because of, the greed of those who sitting at the very top ladder of the echelons of global society. Just recently I saw the statistics that 25% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, they are emitted from the United States of America, and Pakistan's contribution, for example, is less than 1%. Now,
Yes.
Pakistan is already a debt-ridden country.
True.
Already people are, living below poverty line, and the hunger is rampant. It's an epidemic in the country. Those people are having to pay for the profits and super profits being earned by multinational corporations sitting somewhere in New York or Washington. So that it's this inequality, it's this unfairness and injustice that the climate justice movement seeks to address.
Right. That was a very interesting and informative insight of these terms, and I believe that it's really important to put these terms like in its proper context, as you have done that aptly, because it's not just like scientific process of greenhouse gas emissions resulting in climate change, but when you sort of look at it as something which is result of our own sort of unregulated and irrational behavior in our political and social decision. Like, it is something which is product of our own corporate and political behavior, which has like established over time and has become a standard practice of doing business and even navigating through life generally. So I think like without undergoing proper revamp, I don't think our things and our behavior are going to change anytime soon. And in this sense, the government's intervention becomes really important in form of like rules and policy enforcement, which obviously like connects to my next question. And I would like to ask this question from Ms.Sumaviya, that what is like, do you believe that our government is upholding its commitment to environmental justice in accordance with its existing policy framework?
First of all, I would just like to point out a very small thing, that our ministry which deals with these environmental issues is itself called Ministry of Climate Change. Whereas when you see in most part of the world, it's actually called Ministry of Environment or something related to environment it is. So in that sense, we can see that our government does realize the importance of this matter, that it needs to be addressed on urgent basis. When you talk about the policy itself, it is driven from the international commitments Pakistan has basically taken. Just to briefly list out a few things, it talks about your carbon control, it talks about your emissions, it talks about the fact that the temperature should be between 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. It should be maintained within that. At least that's the aim the world and Pakistan itself in its policies trying to sort of achieve. And the initiatives which our government is taking as per those policy is like we saw the 1 billion tsunami tree project, we had the green initiative, and then we also had something which was called the restoration of currently green areas of Pakistan, which essentially took place in Islamabad alone, but that's a different issue. I'm just going to highlight the policy itself first. And then when you, Muneeb very rightly pointed out, when you look at the international commitment, Pakistan is only emitting less than 100% emissions overall towards the world's global warming, towards the world's or towards the climate change itself. So in that sense, we can say that when we are fulfilling our international commitment, when we come forth in front of the world, we are not as backlashed as we are in other aspects. Then you talk about your domestic laws per se. Your domestic laws are quite pertinent to this issue because we cannot leave the policy alone. So Pakistan Environmental Act was basically the main sort of guidelines for all the administrations, institutions, and all the technicalities involved to restore climate change and other environmental aspects. After the 18th Amendment, it has been given to the provinces. So each province has its own act, but more or less the essence of each act remains the same, whether you go to Punjab, Sindh, NWFP or Balochistan's act in that aspect. So basically what that environmental act or how it pertains to climate change is the fact that we have tribunals set in each province. Now each province has a tribunal, and in order to sort of adjudicate or judge the matters, they have a magistrate, environmental magistrate, which has the power of civil laws. So we can see the government has well empowered that judge in order to take the decisions, and the decisions need to be implemented as well. There are laboratories set which define the national environmental quality standards for the factories, which are actually adding up, like he's pointed out, to the smog, all the industrial waste, industrial effluents which are discharged in the water and in the air. That's how they are governed. We have national environmental quality standards, and those laboratories actually are under law obligated to go to the factories to take on the tests and to fine them or to penalize them and to bring them to the environmental justice if they are not following the particular law or particular standard. But obviously, in a country like Pakistan, there are certain barriers as to how much the government offices can operate themselves as well, because of lack of resources.
Yes.
Often at times they are not able to operate as properly because it is a very scientific and technically advanced aspect, climate change. So you need equipments, you sort of need education like that as well, which was going to well govern the whole aspect. On the other hand, it is very easy for them to get bribed because they are not well paid once they go on to carry out the inspections and carry forth their duties as well. But overall, this is the picture of law and policy that has been going on in Pakistan for now.
And I mean, like our government needs to like be very proactive in this regard. Like Pakistan is the 8th most affected country by climate change, and for Pakistan, the climate change-induced conditions have resulted in heavy floods and droughts, which obviously raises serious concerns for the basic necessities like food and water security. And also from legal and constitutional perspective as well, this is like a dire situation for the protection of fundamental rights of the vulnerable segment of society. As you know, as could be deduced from what like Sir Muneeb also said, that climate justice can be defined as the obligation of the state or the duty of the state to guarantee equitable, healthy living conditions to all its citizens, right? But I believe that, you know, all the disasters caused by climate change in Pakistan is not just only because of climate change, but a lot of like things have like greater role to play. We have like poor planning, inadequate resources, poor governance, and lack of accountability, and so on and so forth. Imagine like आपके drought hit areas में आपके जो है golf courses बने हुए हैं, plus जो water courses में आपके जो है markets and घर बने हुए हैं. So I mean, like when governments are inactive and you know, don't take the environmental issues very seriously, the court's intervention becomes really important, and which obviously leads to my next question: that what is our court's approach towards climate justice, and have our courts recognized the adverse impacts of climate change on fundamental human rights? And in addition, if you could also highlight some important case laws regarding this.
For sure. So our courts have been very active generally in carrying out all sorts of public interest litigation, and environmental aspect has been one of the prime areas where our courts have very proactively tried to make decisions which actually give a positive impact, or at least are core sort of judgments to create awareness amongst the masses.
Right.
Shalazia, like we all know, every environmentally aware person would know, was the first case which actually recognized that environment is in fact a right that is sort of, you know, backed up, or that is the core that will hit the core of our constitution if it is not conducted properly. Then when we talk about, since we are in Lahore, we talk about the situation. There was a very important case which was the canal road widening case in this aspect. So in that case, basically, because we know that there's a green belt that runs to canal, and it's one of the very rare roads in Lahore city, Lahore these days, where you see a lot of greenery. So the issue at stake was to carry out the traffic congestion. How is it possible to cut down the green belt a little? So in this, now this case is a very prime and classic example of sustainable development, where courts were engaged in such technical decisions, such experts committees were formed, where they had to sort of balance out the issue that if we do in fact cut down the green belt, how much would it damage the environment, or would it be so minimal that we we move forward with that development. And in the end, considering all the aspects, the court did say that there's only minimal cutting down of the green belt, so they did went on with the development. Now, when you talk about this case with the masses, they say that, you know, the courts were very quick to cut down the green belt, but such an issue like environment, we need to see that you cannot stop the development and then carry forth the environmental aspect. There has to be a balance. So when you look at this case a bit positively, I think such discussions which were conducted in the court should be conducted on every level. When you talk about schools, when you talk about any corporation, that what is the price you are paying for the environment against the development. None of the environmentalists here, and I think Muneeb would agree, would want to stop the development and then move forth with the environmental aspect. This is something I wanted to highlight, because when you discuss this, or when you conduct a discussion on environment, the first backlash you get from the masses is the fact that, we cannot stop the development. So none of us are asking to stop, but there has to be a balance somewhere. Then you have another very important case, which was this signal-free corridor was to be conducted. And the courts again gave a very strict and very environmentally friendly approach, where they said that it is going to deter the environment more than it is going to aid the development like that, or more than it is going to help the traffic per se to move forward freely. And they did not approve that development. So basically, in a country like Pakistan, since we are a developing nation, the more debate on the courts have been on the fact that have been on environment against the development. Then there was this other very interesting case, which was Asghar Lagari case. Which basically talked about 2012's national policy on climate change. And I think those sort of petitions are very much needed even now. So we need them, because he that case highlighted that the government is not able to implement the policy properly. And the courts formed the committees. There was a focal climate change person. So basically, it sort of initiated that there was a deadlock. Policy was there, but there was a deadlock in implementing them, or let's just say even to talk about it. Now that sort of case not just created awareness, it also in a way started that discussion. It started that administrative process to set up the committees to actually start working towards that. So I think our courts, and even I think the lawyers, who are actually concerned about environment or carry out public interest litigation in that sense, have been very proactive in carrying out such cases or giving judgments which are actually in favor of the climate justice. But it again comes down to the implementation of the government. It always boils down to that. So that is where we see a little bit lack in implementing those judgments, because in the end, lawyers and courts can only go forth to the court, get the judgment. The implementation process has to be done by the government in the end.
Exactly. And I mean, like, our constitution does not contain any clause related to right to clean environment. And, this fundamental right framework becomes really empowering for the marginalized communities. And definitely, like, our courts have, adopted a very comprehensive approach to the relationships in light of human rights, and used fundamental human rights as an interpretive tool while navigating through this topic. But as you rightly said, that in the end, everything boils down to the robust enforcement of laws and judgments in its true letter and spirit. And coming towards my next question, which I would like the input of Sir Muneeb on this, that how can environmental issues be effectively, handled with a justice-centered approach? Like, is it really possible? Like, is it really fruitful to handle it with a justice-centered approach? Also, should the courts be panacea for climate change-related issues at first place or not?
Just like, my co-panelist, Ms.Sumaviya, she pointed out the courts have played a very important role. Public interest litigation can quite much be the vehicle for steering the conversation towards a much more, environmental friendly approach. And in that sense, I think that the courts are doing a lot, because there are very few environmental justice, climate justice specific laws. Yes, there is what is known as the PIPA, the Pakistan Environment Protection Act 1997, and it does give us some framework of how the environment is to be regulated, more like the obligations on the government and various public authorities that they have to fulfill. But, modern day challenges that in a post-flood environment, particularly the devastating floods that we saw last year, I think the gaps that are present in the law, those can be filled very constructively by the court. So I understand that the court's intervention in so-called political matters are much criticized in the media, and judicial activism is looked at as a cause of concern. But I think this is one area where the judiciary really can play its part, because I don't think it's only about politics. It is about fundamental rights, which is very much a legal matter. So, for example, through their innovative interpretation techniques, the courts have interpreted the constitution in such a way so as to encompass matters pertaining to climate justice, environmental justice. It's pertinent to note that whether it be the Shaila Zia case, whether that be the Lighari case, or even I was looking at this another case, Maya Khan versus Federation of Pakistan, which came up in 2019. In each of these cases, it is emphasized by the courts that right to life and right to live with dignity encompassed in Articles 4 or 14 of our Constitution, they do include environmental justice within themselves. Interestingly, the courts have also in Pakistan stressed upon something known as public trust doctrine, which is that we are holding the environment on trust for the future generations. So in that sense, intergenerational justice, that is another a legal doctrine that comes into play. And so I think that the courts are exploring very unique, innovative ways of ensuring that something that we've been taking for granted for so many years. Okay, fine. I did say that Pakistan's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions is less than 1%. But within our own society, the fact that there's such a huge urban-rural divide, such a huge class divide, gender divide, I think that those who are particularly vulnerable to the worst effects of climate change, to protect them and to motivate not just the government but also the public to do something about it. Exactly. I think that the courts can play a very important part. Also, I think it gives me immense pride to think of the fact that our delegation at the COP27 recently, led by former Minister Bilal Bhutto Zardari and even our Prime Minister Mia Shahbazi, if you also spoke there, they championed the cause of climate justice globally and internationally, which led to eventually, the formation of a loss and damage fund by the United Nations, which is aimed at dispersing funds to the poorest of the nations who are the least to blame for climate change. And direct those funds away from the developed world to the developing world, which does not have the infrastructure, facilities, or those resources which the developed world has. So that is something we Pakistanis can take immense pride in, that we are leading this cause on an international level. Now, how much of an effect or an impact that creates, only time will tell. But the good thing is conversation started, and not just in Pakistan. I think that the judiciary worldwide, it's really interesting to note that in The Hague, in Netherlands as well, environmental justice was acknowledged as a human right, and even in a very recent claim against Switzerland, the European Court of Human Rights is again centered around climate justice and environmental justice as being considered within the wider term of human rights, that the rights to nature, they are also linked with human rights. And this is very interesting, that rights to nature, when we speak of it, the argument goes along the lines of that it's not just us human beings, but also nature itself, which has rights that need to be protected judicially. And so this is a matter which is very much justiciable and very much within the jurisdiction of the courts. So now that the conversation has started, I believe that even on the international level, there will be not just a policy framework, but actually binding treaties which will turn into customary international law with the passage of time, requiring every single member of the international community, every single state, to ensure that environmental protection is provided to the people, to communities. And that's what's interesting about environmental justice. It's not an individual right, it's a community right. That third generation of rights that we speak of, this is very much in that stage of human rights conversation and discourse that we could fit this in. So I'm glad that the courts are playing their role. And again, the Lighari judgment, for instance, whenever I look at international legal journals or law journals, they do cite that case in particular. So in Pakistan, we do need to talk about this much more than perhaps in many other parts of the world, because not just that we have been very badly affected by climate change in the wake of the floods, but also because unfortunately we are not that developed to be able to tackle with these issues and climate change when it rears its ugly head.
Yeah, true. And I mean, along with the courts being saviors, it is very imperative to create pressure upon governments and corporations to take active role in this regard. I mean, like, अगर individual level पे हम कितना ही कोई अपना carbon footprint कम कर लें, industries and companies constitute for 86% like of the total emission. और the top 100 worst polluting countries जो है, उनकी अकेले सिर्फ 71% carbon emission है. And that leads to my next question, that what role do corporations and industries play in the whole global phenomenon of climate change, and what steps can we take to make them held accountable for their like irresponsible steps and actions?
Unfortunately, it is supposed that corporate profits and environmental protection, they are both at odds with one another, but truth be told, they don't need to be. Not necessarily so. I mean, you could have an environment, no pun intended, which is conducive to corporate profits, which is conducive to development, which is conducive to trade and industry, but at the same time, which can be balanced with environmental rights and ultimately human rights. You don't have to be exploitative of the environment, because that is the very basis for a good, healthy economic system to flourish. So, for instance, a lot of alarm has been raised regarding irresponsible behavior of multinational corporations, from Rio Tinto all the way to Shell. I remember that in 2014, Arctic drilling by drilling in the Arctic by Shell company, that became a very controversial issue, and people were protesting outside the London headquarters of Shell. And in that sense, environmental justice movements have also started, activism has started, and a lot of that is centered around corporate behavior. That the multinational corporations, they are behaving irresponsibly towards environment and ultimately to human life. That of the present generation, more so of the future generations. Extinction Rebellion, very controversial in the UK, but other young activists like Greta Thunberg, now they have taken up the cause to international levels, and it's not just the corporates, it's also the politicians, who are not only negatively impacting upon the environment, but are actively leading the movement of climate change denial, unfortunately. I mean, President Donald Trump, it's right in front of us. Initially, even before Trump, the US backed out of the Kyoto Protocol. But when President Obama came into power, he was one of the key figures to negotiate the Paris climate change deal. And when Donald Trump comes in, he steps out of it. What example is he setting for the other countries? Given the fact that I just mentioned that 25% of greenhouse gas emissions stem from America. So if America, being the superpower that it is, they and their president was saying that there is no such thing as climate change, that it's a hoax and that's a scam. That was very, very damaging. I hope that with President Biden out there, and he does acknowledge climate change as a problem, there is going to be a change. But given the very close nexus between global politics and multinational corporations, of course, corporations need to be regulated at the same time. Now, the problem is that in international law, when we talk of, who are the subjects, it's the states. So there's no direct corporate responsibility under international law. Instead, what has come up is this idea of corporate social responsibility, or CSR as it's known, and there's a UN Global Compact as well. Principles 8 and 9 of which, if I may recall correctly, talk about the obligation on corporates to protect the environment whenever undertaking their industrial endeavors. How much are they following it? Well, there are a lot of companies which have subscribed to the UN Global Compact, and they assure their consumers that they are complying with the principles of the UN Global Compact. But that in itself could be really problematic, because a lot of critics see that as a greenwashing or a blue washing exercise, whereby these corporates are trying to earn prestige among the public eye, that look, we are complying with environmental protections, and we are environmental concerns, and that we are very concerned about the environment. And that acts like a PR exercise for these corporates more than, actual responsibility, because unfortunately there is no external scrutiny. Yes, they are supposed to report to the UN Global Compact on a yearly basis, but there are no enforcement mechanisms, and one doesn't know that, whatever's contained in those reports, if they are ever submitted, that is that true and accurate information that the companies are providing, or is it a greenwashing exercise, as I've just mentioned? So I think another point to consider could be, and this is what the international community will have to do, that they need to extend, broaden the scope of who comes within the remit of international law as their subjects, and perhaps they should be direct corporate responsibility within international law, and international human rights law need to be, centered around corporate responsibility as well, and their treaty bodies need to hold not just states, but also in this day and age where we are facing a climate catastrophe, there's an apocalypse descending upon us, the whole of the planet and the whole of humanity. I think human rights treaties should also now include corporates within their reach.
Yeah, definitely. That's quite unfortunate. It reminds me of a very interesting and quite unfortunate story out of all this discussion, that there is this company named Exxon, which ranks at 5 among 100 most polluting companies, and they actually knew about oncoming climate change and its effects 50 years prior to today. But despite of that, they concealed this fact from the public, and even they spend millions of dollars to spread the propaganda that climate change is not happening, and it's just the agenda of some anti-capitalist persons. So they rightly predicted that by 2020 temperature rise will reach to 0.8 degrees.
Yeah.
How scary is that? Even just increase 0.8 degrees, we are already seeing the wrath of climate change, in form of heavy floods and droughts. And even they have predicted that by 2080 this temperature rise will easily reach 3 to 4 degrees. So coming towards my next question, we see, Ms.Sumaviya, that there is this argument that Pakistan ka overall contribution to climate change is equal to nothing. It's almost 0.8%. But which is right as well. But on the other side, we see that especially in metropolitan cities of Pakistan, there is extreme air pollution, and for that reason, Lahore has been declared as the most or second most polluted city in the world. So, and that is the immediate causality of our own industrial emissions. तो क्या ये वाला argument हम बहुत ज़्यादा buy कर सकते हैं? And secondly, how crucial are sustainable energy and land usage in combating the air pollution and overall climate change? What steps can Pakistan take to transition to a more sustainable and just society, that prioritizes the needs of all its citizens?
Yes, you're completely right that our emission or contribution internationally is very minimal. But when we look within the country, we see that especially in Lahore during the winters, anytime you stepped out of your house, you were not able to breathe properly. True. You could, throughout the winters, at least I could say personally and people around me, we had choked throats, and this is not exaggeration on any end. And we were not even, there was sometimes water in our eyes as well. So very basic सी बात ये होती है कि first internationally you could get saved by the face of it कि हम इतना contribute नहीं करें, because obviously you need to in the end portray good image of your country as well internationally. But when you look within, I think there's dire need, there's an urgent and alarming need to start working towards the environment now, because every year we see the air quality keeps getting worse. And it's not just in Punjab. When you look at Sindh as well, there are droughts there's water shortage throughout. The water quality and the quantity is declining rapidly in Pakistan. So it is sort of an alarming situation. When you talk about any other right, how would you sustain that right when you don't have a home to live in? And by home, I don't mean these four walls. I mean, if you don't have the ecosystem to survive, how are you going to uphold any other right which you claim in your constitution? Like that. So I think as a society, we really need to start looking towards it now. When you talk about, for example, renewable sources, I think that's one area where Pakistan needs to start investing now. and especially when it comes to renewable energy sources, because we can easily sustain on wind and solar power plants per se, because energy is the most talked about aspect in that. The coal plants now they are about to be banned in Pakistan, but there's still many plants, especially in the Sindh area, which are being operated on the coal plants. Or energy sector is heavily contributing towards the environmental damages, especially towards the air quality overall in Pakistan, and in Lahore, as we've seen, it's getting worse. So what we can do is, but again, there's lack of resources for that. Pakistan aims to sort of reduce its emissions by 50% in 2030. That's been projected internationally, but for that we need to rely heavily on the funds that would be given internationally, because I think only, if I'm stating correctly, 15% of our own resources could be used for that matter, and for the other 35% of those 50%, I believe that we would have to rely internationally. Now, when you talk about renewable sources, it's not just energy. The steps which you can immediately take, I believe, are the e-vehicles now going on in the world. You can easily shift to that, because like we said, we also discussed the case of traffic congestion, and we all of us experience on everyday basis. It has become almost impossible to reach from one point in Lahore to another point without getting stuck in the traffic. So you can see the amount of vehicles that are running on the road, and they obviously contribute negatively towards the environment. So I believe good public transports, which are also now I think they have introduced e-bus service, but that's also to a very lesser level again. And then what we need to also sort of advocate here is how an individual can cut down, because most of the vehicles we see are private vehicles. How an individual can cut down. One aspect could be public transport. Then you could have good walking paths, because when you go abroad, you see that there's a proper mechanism where within the city as well, you could take a walk if there's a shorter period of distance. That doesn't happen in Pakistan. Then there are e-bikes. For example, Germany during the COVID period, especially the introduction, or they were already in Germany. I think the usage of e-bikes was taken to a much higher level than it was done before COVID hit the countries. So such measures could really be beneficial for Pakistan as well, moving towards obviously environmentally friendly energy sources, but that's long-term basis. Like he mentioned, that there's a green fund now.
Yes.
There's a loss and damage fund. So there are so many doors you can tap internationally, especially after the Paris Agreement, where ever since the Paris Agreement came, I think what was most ignored by especially Pakistan or the developing nation was that the developed nations are under a duty to sort of help developing nations lower their emissions, or sort of help them become more environmentally friendly. That was something which was that was just ignored by our country in all cases. Now you have green funds, you could take help of that. You have loss and damage funds, then international partnerships. If you go back around 10 years ago, most of the energy investments were carried out by American power plants in Pakistan. But again, like we said, that because of a political situation, most of their power plants withdrew their companies from Pakistan. And now when you look at other countries, those same power plants are running renewable energy sources. And when you compare that with Pakistan, we are still relying on coal and other energy sources which are highly detrimental to the environment. So I believe once you give that comfort to international companies to come to Pakistan and start investing here, that in itself, it's going to be a very positive move, but that heavily relies on our state and political situation.
Yeah, and I mean, there is this prevalent myth also that sustainable businesses and economic growth are negatively correlated. Like they can't coexist together, while a lot of researchers have established that those companies who have transitioned into more sustainable businesses have seen exponential growth in their financial performances as well. And I mean, it is very much in the hands of the government. They can do a lot of things about it. Like the Chinese government proclaimed its war against pollution in 2013. And better pollution regulation, transfer of industries from the populous regions, and government's paying to farmers to prevent agricultural burning. And what happened that between 2013 and 17, air quality improved by 35%, and even in most in those cities where air pollution was most concentrated. So, yeah. So coming towards next question, Muneeb, which is also like this question is very close to my heart and which confuses me a lot as well. That we know that businesses have accelerated innovation and the way we live. Like, I mean, there is this right to life and there is right to business, and both are like equally important. And businesses have allowed many people to live longer with a better quality of life. But on the other side, we also see that businesses and the way they are run have put humanity on a catastrophic path.
Yeah.
So, is it really possible to make businesses harmonious with the world and at the same time like be more profitable? We see that governments, deregulate companies in order for them to make them earn more profits.
Yeah.
And almost every government focus is on the growth of GDP, which means a healthy society. People are earning their livelihoods for themselves, and people are happy. Happy countries growing, but that GDP metric doesn't take into account the social and environmental considerations in account. So how can these internal imbalances be addressed?
I mean, it's known as externalities, the costs, which are incurred due to degradation of the environment and loss of ecosystem. These costs are not taken into account. For instance, when companies are setting their prices or when they are taxed and etc. etc. So government regulation is what is needed. First of all, that if you increase the prices of goods which cost more environmentally, now that could be a disincentive for corporates in acting irresponsibly, because that is only going to drastically reduce their sales or negatively impact their sales. Similarly, government subsidies should be cut down for those companies which are involved in environmentally detrimental activities. That could be another way. And of course, there could be a requirement for every company to give a compliance report to the government. There should be a commission or a committee or a public body set up to scrutinize companies exactly for these things, whether they're complying with environmental protection, they are balancing their corporate activities with the environment, or are they detrimentally impacting upon environment. Because the Paris Agreement deal says that global greenhouse gas emissions are going to be lower to or climate change is going to be lower to 2 degrees Celsius, and every country by 2030 should aim for 1.5 degree target, whereas by 2050 you should have achieved net zero emissions. I don't think, and I'm not just speaking of our own country, I don't think anywhere in the world they are near that target, and particularly the economic setback that so many countries, including the developed countries, the cost of living crisis that they faced owing to the COVID-19 pandemic and now the Russia-Ukraine war, means that it's not even on the agenda to limit exploitative corporate behavior. Actually, they want to encourage corporates to invest, to produce more, so that the economic setback that has been suffered, and I'm talking mostly about the Western global powers right now, that economic loss is recovered. And so in that regard, when they're not even taking into consideration the environmental costs of corporate activity, I don't think that we are anywhere near achieving net zero emissions. And also, there's this very interesting point that just came to mind, was that corporates, I even mentioned earlier, that corporates are not necessarily supposed to be hostile to the environment, because short-term gains, yes, they might be there. But in the long run, if there are floods, if there are tsunamis, if there are wildfires, that environment is not going to be conducive to business anyway. So we are also talking about not just environmental sustainability, but also sustainability of business. How can business be sustained? How can livelihoods be sustained? How can even corporate profits be sustained, for that matter, if the planet itself is under a huge threat, and we are not blowing it out of all proportions? It's really an emergency right now. Climate emergency is real. There are scientific studies to that effect. So, ultimately governments and corporates and basically the whole of the global population, we are all stakeholders. They will have to make up their mind, are we to take it seriously, or because we may not be immediately feeling the impact of what's happening,
Yeah.
We are to turn a blind eye that, future generations are going to take care of it.
Yeah, true. Definitely. And I mean, it's high time, for the states to take some practical actions like removing fossil fuel subsidies and increasing taxes on highly polluting companies, and taking greater role in social security. Coming towards my next question, Ms.Sumaviya, like we all know that climate change cannot be defeated without the cooperation of international community, and we see that some steps have also been taken by a lot of states. Like in 2016, many countries entered into a Paris Climate Agreement.
Yeah.
But as pointed out by Sir Muneeb as well, that no practical steps, like all the steps and actions taken by governments and corporations doesn't seem to limit that temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius, as like Paris Climate Agreement says.
Yeah.
So what sort of international legal regime we have in place, which can and how states are responding to it?
So when we talk about any international agreement, treaty, or any international arrangement, I think what sort of deters its effect is that, again, we are dealing with sovereign states in the end. So we need to realize that when we talk about any international agreement or treaty we have signed, so in the end, it's going to be their own interest over, if we look at the very practical picture of it, over what they have signed. When you talk about it in terms of environment, I think Paris Agreement is one major sort of document that deals with climate change, like you have rightly mentioned that. But it still is not sufficient or adequate, like we can clearly see, to deal with the entire catastrophic effect we are dealing with right now, or the sort of phase we are in for the environment. Because now is the time the entire world cannot deny it. Like, it's not something which may happen. It's not something where you see minimal effects. It's something you see as soon as you walk out of your house, and it happens in developed and developing nation as well. Now, under the Paris Agreement, after every 5 years, there's a meeting where all the countries gather together, they sit together, and then they discuss their contribution towards emissions and the role they have played in keeping that climate towards 2 degrees Celsius. Now, recently, I think when you talk about USA, they pass certain legislations and laws which, if they are implemented properly, by the next time the meeting is held, there's going to be 40% reduced emissions on their account. So, like we said, we're dealing with sovereign states. So any state coming to that 5-year meeting also in itself is very impactful per se. Like Muneeb pointed out that, especially after Trump's statements that climate change is just something which is made up concept, this year when US showed up and sort of presented its steps towards reducing the emissions and its steps towards preserving that temperature, I think that in itself was not enough, but it was a positive step by them. Then you talk about Brazil. Amazon forest is considered to be something lungs of the earth. Now we have sort of impacted, by we I mean it's an individual responsibility as well. So all of us have impacted the environment in such a way that there was a time that entire Brazil was running on hydroelectric plants. Now there's a drought in parts of Brazil as well, somewhere where you sort of claim that you have the heart of your, you have the lungs of your earth in the country. Now they've shifted towards other sources of energy as well. So, this is the intensity we need to realize, and this is the alarming situation we need to realize we are having. One positive thing about China is that they have moved majorly towards e-vehicles, but then again, their economy sort of also impacts, their economic development impacts the environment very negatively as well. So we have the international regime, but as long as states are themselves willing to put that effort in, I think we might see the environment get worse each year in that sense.
Yes. So, Sir Muneeb, there is this argument that global North is responsible for what is happening in global South in terms of climate change, and the developed states have definitely developed themselves at the expense of developed states. अगर पाकिस्तान के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हम देखें, like the recent floods, 20 बिलियन का नुकसान हुआ पाकिस्तान को, और हमारी इतनी कैपेसिटी है नहीं to like adapt to the conditions induced by the climate change. So, and also there have been talks that, developed states should pay reparations to the developing states. So, can that be really materialized? Do we have any legal framework for that?
Um, I mean, this is a very recent phenomenon that they're talking about, setting up a loss and damage fund to compensate, and not just to compensate, but also to enable developing or underdeveloped countries to recover from the catastrophic, consequences and results of climate change. But unfortunately, any specific law as such about reparations, no, because this talk is very recent. Like I said, the Pakistan and Pakistani delegation, they championed the cause of climate justice at the COP27 recently. And our former Minister Bilal Bhutto Zardari, he really emphasized upon was that debt relief is one of the factors that needs to be looked at, because a country like Pakistan, which is already debt ridden, so if you're so embroiled in debt servicing and returning and repaying debts, and you don't get any relief, then the climate change and its negative impacts that people of Pakistan are suffering from, there's never going to be any way out. So, I mean, the same countries that we owe so much debt to, perhaps they could set that off.
Yes.
They could set the debt off with the contribution that they have made to negatively and adversely impacting our climate, and thereby destroying so many livelihoods. That could be one factor. Another, of course, factor could be that this fund that they have set up, so they need to come to the rescue of countries which are underdeveloped. And reparation, or the idea of reparation is, or even transformative justice, is that you are, or restorative justice, you are to put those communities back in the situations that they would have been, or they were in, had it not been for your neglect of the environment, had it not been your irresponsible activities which have led to such a how does one even put it? It's so bad that we've been led to this devastating situation, and people suffering, and around 1,600 people dead, and hundreds of thousands of people displaced and homes destroyed. They are shelterless, living in camps, living like refugees in their own countries. All of that. The word reparation is the word which is most apt here, because it's about compensation. It's about paying back. It's also about holding those countries accountable, holding those governments accountable, whose irresponsible activities have led to this catastrophic situation.
Yeah, true. And like, it's quite horrific to know that. And I mean, reparation should include the technical assistance, adaptation planning, and along with funds, there, like, developed states should provide access to the green technologies as well, because for developing states,
yes,
it is the adaptation that they cannot afford. हुआ है, like climate change तो उनके conditions उन पे impose हो चुके हैं. अब उनको क्या करना है? They need to adapt. अब उनको वो तभी adapt कर सकते हैं.
And also, renewable forms and renewable sources of energy, that's very important for a country like Pakistan.
True.
And what we've seen recently in the aftermath of the floods is that there weren't infrastructure facilities available in the rural areas. The homes that were constructed on such weak foundations that the floods were bound to destroy those homes the way that they were. So how the houses built, how the roads built, is there enough infrastructure to be able to withstand and to weather the floods and the climate catastrophes which are going to be encountered now? It's unfortunately become a reality, but are we prepared? So preparedness. So if the international community is disbursing funds to a country like Pakistan, how is our government utilizing those funds? Are they utilizing it responsibly, or are those funds only being diverted to urban areas which are already relatively better protected? That is another area that needs to be looked at.
True. So due to time constraint, I'm posing last question to Ms.Sumaviya, that how can Pakistani citizens, especially youth and marginalized, can be empowered to take an active role in this whole global phenomenon of climate justice?
So to empower youth, I think first of all you need to make them aware of the situation we are dealing with, and that starts with schooling, of course. every young child should be aware that this is the phenomena the world or Pakistan is facing, and then you need to sort of start educating them at a very early stage that this is something they need to be consciously aware of. At a very basic level, you can start, I'll just talk about environment in general and then move towards climate change specifically as well, that so you can substitute plastic with other wooden or spoons in the canteens, in the cafes, everywhere you go, in every school I teach, or in every school you just visit, every campus, there's no specific thing. A lot of plastic is being used in the canteens. There are plastic cups, plastic straws, plastic, just culinary. It sort of puts you so much off that I have chosen to walk out of those areas per se, because when the world is dealing with so much of the issue by this environment, there's a small contribution, and it's not very financially it's just a small step that you can take. So I think such awareness starts from the schools and homes in the very beginning. We have been raised in Pakistani households, and we have this concept of putting everything into plastic boxes and storing them in our fridge. So it starts from home and school, and then when you move towards your colleges, obviously I think it should be a mandatory topic that is discussed everywhere, not just law schools, not just social sciences. I believe entirely, even if you're going to the med school or engineering school, if you're not specializing in this aspect as well, this is something you need to make your students very well aware of. So once it's consciously embedded into their minds, that's when they will be empowered. That's when they'll realize that they need to be empowered to be able to protect the environment. And then how, at a very basic level, there's so many law moots being held. I've seen none of them being held on the issue of environment per se, because maybe it's not that sort of a topic still amongst youth that they'd be willing to participate in, or there could be so many factors still. So there's this lack of that conscious mindset that now is the time that we need to very consciously and very proactively start working towards that. How governments could, for example, empower these young people is that you need to hold such workshops, conferences, and especially those informal discussions like we were discussing before the show as well. I think that's where the youth becomes more interactive. The more comfort you will give to the youth, the more they'll be willing to share their opinions and their aspects. So discussions like you guys have held, I think it's a phenomenal step towards it. So such discussions would obviously not just sort of make you network with the people who have already worked on the environment, that will also encourage you to work towards that. Then inclusion in the ministries, because environment is something which is greatly impacting the young generation, which is going to come more than all of us who are already existing on this planet. So I believe the inclusion of such activists, inclusion of such minds who are actually willing to work towards environment would be very beneficial step, because the country we live in, because when we talk about government, there has to be a gray-haired man or a woman, with a lot of experience, not realizing that this is something which needs to be talked about at a very basic and a very young level. It does not just specifically have to be someone who has a lot of obviously experience matters, but these are some steps when you start taking them. I think the youth, when they're raised consciously about certain aspect, they'll be able to work towards that as well. So I believe these are some capacity building, for example, is very important in this aspect. So I think these are some measures if you take, youth could actually play a huge role in curing, I would actually want to use this word, in curing the earth, which is actually sort of deteriorating every day we live.
Right. Definitely we need to have more of this conversation around. And I mean, like, after gaining an in-depth knowledge and awareness about an issue, and then like thinking about what steps are needed to combat that, that's really when we start thinking about what role can we play, like in our own capacity. And I mean, obviously political actions are required, collective actions, like individual level, individual contribution का इतना कुछ खास फायदा होगा नहीं. Plus there is high time that we need that robust system of checks and balances to put sort of put limitation on the corporate ambitions. I think with that our program time has also come to an end. Thank you so much for tuning into Legal Impact program series. I hope you would have gained something from this program. Take care, and Allah Hafiz.